At last, and for better or for worse, I now have a webcam. Now, before I begin with what would be the final installment in the father and son Shaara trilogy that began with the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel The Killer Angels, written by Michael Shaara, adapted by Ronald F. Maxwell in 1993, titled Gettysburg, and then to the prequel, written by Jeff Shaara, titled Gods and Generals, also adapted by Ronald F. Maxwell in 2003, and then there's finally The Last Full Measure. But first I wish to talk about a certain documentary that came out in 2020, simply entitled Grant.
Ulysses S Grant is this perfectly average, humble individual from a poor, hard-scrabble background. It's truly an American story, not only patriotism to the nation, but for the values of who we are and who we aspire to be.
Now, while I didn't dislike this documentary, I did find it somewhat underwhelming. Common criticisms to begin with would include the overbombardment of advertising throughout. Then there's just the general inaccessibility, which I can attest to being outside the United States of America. The reenacted scenes are also a little iffy at best, and the cast generally lacked when it came to charisma. But my biggest issue is, again, and say it with me, to a lack of balance. In recent times, it has become somewhat of a new fad, the reinvigorated noble cause narrative of the North, and how General Ulysses Hiram Grant was the ultimate general, the epitome of humility and the most noble of heroes. This documentary reminds or presents like Ronald F. Maxwell's Gods and Generals, rather instead as that glorified Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson, proclaiming him the next iteration of John Lann, or Jesus.
Lord, you show us the way, we will follow.
Well, this does much the same for Ulysses Hiram Grant. This documentary conveys a very surface-level representation and analysis of his history. Akin to the Lost Cause mythology that elevated Lee to the heights of Olympus, there has been a newfound romanticized narrative of late for Grant, where it ironically renders him inhuman, the pinnacle of perfection, often comes across as saccharine and devoid of any real depth.
He's been called so many things over the years.
The greatest general of his time.
A military genius.
A bloody butcher.
A corrupt president.
A belligerent drunk who got lucky. He didn't get lucky.
Now, before you reach for the pistol or saber, I do not fully subscribe to the Frank Varney deconstruction, but he does raise his fair share of quality points in his work General Grant and the rewriting of history, and when seeking to restore lost valor for the blighted career of General William Stark Rosecrans. But like Varney's deconstruction of Grant, this documentary presses to the greatest extremes to paint General Grant in the most positive light, seldom addressing some of his more noteworthy failings, and therein lies the documentary's weakness. You needn't mistake me, General Grant was an absolute force to be reckoned with, and perhaps the most remarkable strategic mind of the entire conflict. His foresight that would lead to the capture of the sinking Fort Henry, Lloyd Tillman really never had a chance, and to the unconditional surrender of Fort Donelson, subduing the tits-for-hands triumvirate of Floyd, Pillow, and Buckner. Then there's his piece de resistance, his Vicksburg campaign. This specific campaign might be the most impressive of the entire war. Coordinating once again with amphibious forces led by Admiral Porter, Grant would swing his army around Vicksburg, utilize Grierson through raids to draw Pemberton's attention, then swiftly impede any opportunity for Joseph E. Johnston to reinforce Vicksburg from Jackson, Mississippi. Although I think what Jackson achieved in the Shenandoah Valley was plain ridiculous, repelling the collective command of Nathaniel P. Banks through his audacious and rapid foot cavalry, isolating individual units from McDowell through to the conclusive final engagements at Port Republic. Then again, one must consider the folly of Banks, infamous for the Red River Campaign also. On the other hand, there's John C. Pemberton, not exactly the most staunch and decisive officer in defence of the South Zone Gibraltar. Perhaps a conversation for another time. Nevertheless, and despite Grant's strategic brilliance, I do have reservations over showering Grant with praise for his tactical capabilities in the field, and for his leadership qualities with respect to personnel. To the documentary's credit, it does recognise how Grant lost control of his men amid the occupation of Polk's camp at Belmont. But beyond that, there's not much of note. While Shiloh might be the best segment in the documentary,
we've had the devil's own day, haven't we? Look him tomorrow, though.
To Grant's recovery in face of the onslaught inflicted by Albert Sidney Johnston and his Army of Mississippi, there's little note for the neglecting of intelligence, mainly on Sherman here, nor the petty feuding with Buell over rank and upon his arrival with reinforcements, or for the failed offensives against Vicksburg and at Missionary Ridge. Why must we so rarely receive a Civil War offering with balance? It is with this sanctimonious glorification of Grant throughout the documentary where it began to grate, whether that be with the narrative attempting to paint General Grant as an everyman, an individual of great humility. Even if this might have been the case earlier in his career, nothing of the evidence would suggest he retained of this quality throughout the Civil War itself, noting that his presidency, generally criticised, was mired with one scandal after the next, suffered from rampant cronyism, nepotism, corruption, and then comes the challenge with claiming the moral high ground in face of breaching the Lakota Treaty. There be gold in those hills indeed, native inhabitants be damned. Even in the course of his command militarily, he would make some, shall we say, questionable decisions. With respect to Jewish people, and during the Vicksburg campaign, where he would expel Jews from his military district that comprised of Tennessee, Mississippi, and Kentucky. This would require Lincoln's intervention to rescind the order. All this documentary accomplishes is to deflect, minimizing Grant's weaknesses while only lightly and on the rarest occasion acknowledging Grant's poor judgment, his flaws, such as with his presidency, with specific mention to Orville E. Babcock, infamous for his involvement with Black Friday and the Whiskey Ring of 1875. However, I do appreciate the coverage for his efforts with Reconstruction. While Reconstruction proved a failure, Grant's efforts, at least in my opinion, are commendable. Therefore, am I being too harsh on Grant and this documentary? Maybe. But there were episodes throughout the Civil War that also provide room for pause, that might have foreshadowed what was to follow with the failings of his presidency. And that is where personnel management and leadership intangibles take centre stage. You see, his cronyism was not a newfound quality upon his inauguration to the highest post in the land. He certainly had his favourites. He would favour those who were his friends, almost subservient to him and his will in its entirety, failing to recognise and award those on merit. Frankly, and throughout the Civil War, some of his personnel decisions and relationships were absolute disasters. There's this bias he would show towards the likes of General Sherman, McPherson, Schofield, and Sheridan, famously undermining other capable commanders such as Generals Meade, Thomas, and even despite his wards, John A. McClernand. This would include presenting Sherman with the best opportunities for glory and responsibility, and while it worked out eventually with the Atlanta campaign and the subsequent march to the sea, Sherman underwent his own growing pains with the horrible defeat at Chickasaw Bayou, poor offensives against Missionary Ridge, and failed and costly assaults against the fortified Vicksburg. With Grant, there was also this evident selfish pursuit of his own glory. I acknowledge in this he wasn't alone, and he would compete with Generals Buell, Rosecrans, and Halleck for further clout, and to name of the West in what could be summarized as a dick-measuring contest. For example, he would feud with Buell upon his arrival at Shiloh, and that would essentially allow Beauregard to slip away from his grasp. He undermined Rosecrans at Iuka, and he constantly quarreled with McClernand. Blame could be shared across these generals when failure or disappointing outcomes would arise.
The victory was barren in every other particular. Corinth had already been evacuated. A well-directed attack would at least have partially destroyed the defending army.
But that doesn't absolve Grant from some responsibility with managing relationships and with navigating the military politic. Turning briefly to the east, he would also place his trust and support in officers frankly incapable. That would include Generals William F. Smith, Ambrose E. Burnside, Quincy A. Gilmore, and Franz Sigel. General Smith would badly bungle a prime opportunity to seize Petersburg. Burnside would perform poorly during the Wilderness and the ill-fated Battle of the Crater. Gilmore squandered opportunities at Petersburg and Charleston. And Sigel would be badly routed in the Shenandoah Valley and at the Battle of Newmarket. I could continue, and while there are further factors for consideration, I believe it fair to question his management and decision-making with respect to his subordinates. I hadn't even mentioned the treatment of Gouverneur K. Warren or George G. Meade, two underrated individuals who often don't receive their fair dues. My point is it is somewhat of a reach to proclaim Grant as this galvanizing presence and strong judge of character, as illustrated through this gushing documentary. If not evident, and to this point, I'm seeking to act as some kind of counterweight. Returning to the tactics on the battlefield, and as I mentioned prior, where with the documentary it did cover his setback during the Battle of Belmont.
Hey boys, Look what I found.
Captain! Yeah! Control your men! Yes, sir!
There's little coverage to the surprise assault led by Pillow the next morning and at the Battle of Fort Donelson, nor is there much acknowledgement for others, specifically Thomas, who resides within this documentary as more or less a footnote, and whose corps ultimately would land the decisive blow that overcame the frail entrenchments along Missionary Ridge and at the Battle for Chattanooga. And despite Grant angling for others like Sherman and McPherson to receive the glory, how he would continuously undermine Thomas, who's often touted as the best corps commander of the Union, throughout the conflict. The documentary did rightly indicate Grant's regret with Cold Harbor.
I have always regretted the last assault at Cold Harbor.
And to his personnel decisions involving the debacle that was the crater. But it continuously acted to minimize the interesting aspects of his struggles, specifically those self-inflicted, while harping on about his many successes. A quality documentary manages to achieve in providing some balance, to highlight the flaws and weaknesses of its subject, where it would cover how Grant overcame his struggles with the bottle, much credit to John A. Rawlins, and with how he retained his composure in face of such horror through the Overland Campaign, maintaining his bulldog-like grip upon Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. To see Grant, for his warts and all, makes for a far more compelling character study. Why must we continue to sugarcoat, wrap in cotton wool our historical figures, or to do the exact opposite, to vilify or deconstruct? Just as I can be critical of Grant, the notion that he was nothing more than a butcher was just plain bollocks. That narrative also diminishes the quality of his opponent. Both were remarkable generals, each with their strengths and weaknesses, and the contrasting views, perspectives, how we have so much information and stories about these individuals is what makes the subject of the Civil War so endearing. It's little wonder that a certain Samuel Clemens recognised what an opportunity it would be to assist this gentleman, Grant, with writing his historic memoirs.
That boy can sing.
Well, that Mr. Clemens can certainly write. Finally, with respect to Shaara's The Last Full Measure, and in continuation of his novel Gods and Generals, not the film version, I want to read of the flaws, the mistakes, the humanity, as all of it reflected the good and the bad, rather than receive the equivalent of a Harlequin romance novel for reenactors and Grant stands. Just like Gods and Generals covered the events from the beginning of the conflict up to the victory of the Army of Northern Virginia at the Battle of Chancellorsville, The Last Full Measure covers the events from the Bristoe Station campaign of November 1863 to Robert E. Lee's final surrender at Appomattox Courthouse of April 1865. There is no Hancock, nor obviously is there any Jackson. Instead, we receive chapters for Lee, along with a few for Longstreet, Stewart, and Hill, essentially, and as they, like dominoes, were to fall. For the Union, we have Chamberlain again, and now General Grant, having transferred to the Eastern Theatre of the war. While I was critical of Chamberlain in Gods and Generals, and with the emphasis placed upon him as a protagonist in the earlier stages of the conflict, there's just more meat on the bone with him elevated to Brigadier General, and post his heroics at Gettysburg, awarded this rank in the belief it would be a posthumous promotion, him being critically wounded at Second Petersburg, where he'd again return to endure only more horrors, then received the honour to command the Union troops with Lee's final surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Alongside or opposite Lee, Chamberlain remains the one constant principal point of view character throughout the trilogy, and I enjoyed his chapters where he'd again find himself critical of command decisions and behaviours, reminiscent to Hancock and Gods and Generals. While hopeful that this next battle might lead to a breakthrough and the Army of Northern Virginia's final defeat, through Chamberlain we share in his vulnerability as he faces one opposing soldier after another intent on killing him, how very close he comes to meeting his demise time and again on the battlefield. He hasn't any superhuman powers, there's no comic book style glorification, war is truly hell. The strength of both the father and son's depictions of General Lee continues. With The Last Full Measure, we experience Lee's desperation.
In the center, they will break.
How his unwavering faith in God, his army, and his cause slowly unravels. With the West now a complete dumpster fire, the once firm Jefferson Davis, now frail and faltering, unable or unwilling to rely upon Beauregard or Johnston, asking only for more of him, more of Robert E. Lee. But there is only one Robert E. Lee, and he then loses Longstreet at the Wilderness, Stewart at Yellow Tavern, and now he must turn to someone else, but who? Loneliness takes hold. The questioning of his cause begins to echo louder, and in the forlorn belief the Confederacy could still claim her independence. Jackson is dead. His other corps commanders, while promising, prove much too green. We experience this with Hill's mistake at Bristoe Station, and the Army of Virginia's margin for error is just so slim. Richmond is no longer what he remembered. Lucius B. Northrop, perhaps the South's worst general, has again failed him. His army is starving. Shaara showcases how remarkable Lee was throughout the grueling Overland Campaign and subsequent Petersburg campaigns, how he manages to hold his army together for as long as he did with so few, and in face of an enemy that is only becoming stronger. But it is also my opinion that Shaara doesn't over-glorify Lee either. He doesn't hesitate to highlight the errors of judgment from Lee, like at the Muleshoe during Spotsylvania Courthouse, where he removes his artillery, and that culminates in the destruction of the famous Stonewall Brigade, to his ailing health, and to his delusions of grandeur, the desire for one last gasp offensive that might break the Union Army of the Potomac. With Grant, and unlike the documentary, he's not portrayed as a superhuman entity. It is a fairer and honest account of the general. Through his portrayal of Grant, we see the suffering he endures as the losses continue to increase, how he experiences a moment of weakness or to grieve after witnessing the horrors of the wilderness, how he must focus upon the army despite his concerns for his beloved friend James Longstreet on the other side of the picket lines, having fallen grievously wounded. And then, can Grant actually beat Lee? Lee is no Pillow, Bragg, or Pemberton.
Lee's taken our land, forced us out. He's gonna advance.
I'm tired of hearing about what Lee is gonna do. Some of you think he's gonna turn a double somersault and land in our rear and both flanks at the same time. Go back to your commands. Think about what we're gonna do.
But Grant recognizes the damage inflicted upon his side must be felt greater by his opponent.
General Meade, don't forget, we possess strengths they do not have. Our numbers.
However, and while he recognizes the reality with respect to a war of attrition, stabilizing his command structure and to bolster their resolve, he faces his own challenges and burdens of leadership. He has lost General Sedgwick. The papers begin to preach about the Butcher's Bill. Lincoln's re-election isn't a guarantee, and the desperation only mounts to achieve a final breakthrough. And yet in face of all of this, he perseveres, unflinching and in control. Where is Burnside? He'd recovered his reputation at Knoxville, but now he's lost somewhere in the wilderness. Grant must also again recognize the folly of his own personnel decisions. He listened to Sheridan, appeasing the fiery cavalry commander, rejecting Meade's protestations, and the army is now blindly shifting from North Anna to Cold Harbor. What of reconnaissance? The first advance was an error, but the second he had ordered despite the protestations, and what resulted was a colossal loss of life. Alas, history has repeated itself. Lee was left blind by Stuart at Gettysburg.
Your mission was to free this army from the enemy cavalry and to report any movement by the enemy's main body. That mission was not fulfilled.
Ordered an ill-fated charge against Cemetery Ridge.
Friend, it is all my fault. Hear me, I pray you.
Burnside again lets him down at the crater. Butler has met with disaster at Bermuda Hundred. Sigel has lost at Newmarket. Grant laments his misjudgment of Smith to his failure at Petersburg. Despite all these setbacks and mistakes, we experience through Grant's point of view chapters that he never let it break him. Nor would he repeat the past failings of other officers and to fall back in defeat. Grant was relentless, persistent, and exactly what Lincoln needed. He achieved what others, and to this point, could not. Throughout the novel, and much like history, the emphasis is placed upon, and while recognizing his weaknesses, to the bulldog grip, in his recognition of the bigger picture and to grand tactics. How he would facilitate and coordinate with Sherman, while seeking to motivate Meade to press forward no matter the cost. But then again, the book also praises his innate ability to adapt. The Overland Campaign, other than achieving a war of attrition that always favoured the North, was an emphatic failure. But then Grant pivots, beelines for the vulnerable Petersburg, and eventually a breakthrough is achieved at last. Grant was a relative figure with weaknesses and even greater strengths. And these strengths prevailed when it mattered most, where he would lead the great army of the Potomac to victory. Where Grant 2020 was a documentary entirely focused upon the life, military career, and inauguration of he who would become the 18th President of the United States of America, I believe it provides a somewhat lackluster appraisal. It isn't without its merits. Justin Salinger is fine, and there is at last more coverage and attention upon the Western theatre of the war. As for the novel, even when Grant was not the principal focus of the last full measure, Shaara achieved a more comprehensive evaluation over the actions, the decision-making, the personality, the humanity, the strengths and weaknesses within its weaving narrative. Other than for those with a passing curiosity for the Civil War and specifically for Ulysses Simpson, Hiram Grant, the 18th President, I half-heartedly recommend the documentary. For those who would like to know more and would like to enjoy a solid narrative with strong and interesting characters, I would certainly recommend Jeff Shaara's The Last Full Measure.